This feeling of helplessness, this feeling of, well, our governments are not delivering. What do? We are doomed. Now, over the years, we've seen a number of international agreements, from the Paris Agreement, the amendment to the Montreal Protocol, the Baku COP that just ended, the Brazilian G20 that just ended. What we're not getting is sufficient climate ambition. What we need is increased climate action and accountability. So there's an urban scale, how we design our cities. Within those cities, there's a material and design scale. Then we have that material and design coming together in built spaces. And then we have our own individual behavior within those built spaces. I've just recently returned from the climate negotiations in Baku. I'm delighted to be here at Conscious Collective, and thank you so much for inviting me here and inviting my colleagues to be part of this, to feel, to touch, to feel, to hear about things that seem a little bit more real than these abstract negotiations that happen. Because until and unless we're able to connect this very grand global challenge to things that we can do, to things that we can experience, to the spaces in which we inhabit and in which we work, it will continue to feel far away, distant, abstract, impossible to deal with, a cause for despair rather than delivery. So today I wanted to focus on how we move from those empty promises towards these building blocks of climate action, particularly in the context of the built environment. I represent the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are an independent policy research institution. Mr. Jamshid Godrej is our chairperson. We work across these three pillars: system-level transformations in the low-carbon economy, in the energy transition, in industrial sustainability, in creating sustainable jobs. But we also focus on the quality of life issues: the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, how we move from place to place, how we cool ourselves in a hot country. To make any of that happen, we need the enablers of technology, of finance, of pushing along a circular economy, of building resilience. But in order to do any of this, ultimately it boils down to how do we take ideas in one place, experiments in another place, and scale it up in a third place. It's those ideas that I wanted to share with you today. But in order to understand why this is important, it is still necessary to get to terms a little bit more with the scale of the crisis we are faced with. When we use the word vulnerability, what do we really mean? Do we mean, are we vulnerable against floods? Are we vulnerable against droughts? Are we vulnerable against heat stress or cold waves? Are we vulnerable against forest fires or coastline degradation? In some ways, it's a bit of all of the above. This map that you see plots out various kinds of early warning that has been delivered over the last 2 decades across the world. So it could be, for instance, earthquakes in one part of the world, or tsunamis in another part of the world, or these green areas, very large plots of green areas where wind speeds are upwards of 138 kilometers per hour. So driving cyclonic winds across the world. And then you see these dotted paths where drought conditions are emerging across the world. It's not just concentrated in a few places. And then you see heat stress building up. Basically, the climate problem is not just about average temperature rise. It's a compounding effect, and it's a non-linear crisis. What do I mean by non-linear? It means what seemed like an extreme event yesterday becomes normal today. What seems extreme today begins to become normal tomorrow. In 2024 alone, we've had unprecedented increases in temperature. We are well across over 1.5 degrees of warming. In India, across the world, 15 national heat records have been broken. There have been a 5 times increase in natural disasters over the last 5 decades. In just the first half of this year, about $130 billion of damages in economic losses have occurred across the world. In fact, last year, it was over $270 billion, and guess what? Over $130 billion was completely uninsured. So not only are we vulnerable, the impacts are rising, and there's no cushion to land back on. And against this crisis, we've got these abstract promises that are made in climate negotiations. And we realize that those promises are insufficient. They're called NDCs, the nationally determined contributions that countries go to these climate negotiations and submit. And we see that even with a complete implementation of those NDCs across nearly 200 countries in the world, we'll still be not reducing emissions by about 22 billion tons by 2030 compared to what we need to stay on track and keep temperature levels under 1.5. And then we have something called net zero. So emissions are on the rise. You've got to plateau them out and pull them down close to zero. 110 countries have pledged net zero. Even if all of them are met by 2050, we would still have this emissions gap of 13 gigatons or billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And it's this excess of carbon in the atmosphere which is then causing the greenhouse effect, which is then causing those extreme weather events and the vulnerability that I was referring to earlier. Now, over the years, we've seen a number of international agreements, from the Paris Agreement to the amendment to the Montreal Protocol, the Baku COP that just ended, the Brazilian G20 that just ended. What we're not getting is sufficient climate ambition. What we need is increased climate action and accountability. At CEEW, we've been mapping out what countries have been doing, not just what they've been promising. And we see only 2 developed countries are on track to achieve their NDCs by 2030. Only 5 developed countries are on track to reach net zero. And even if they reach net zero, they alone would end up consuming about half of the entire remaining carbon budget that we have for the entire world. So then we decided to look at what other countries are doing in terms of the G20. The G20 includes the rich and the poor in terms of the largest economies, and no one is a climate leader. Whether it is India, whether it's the United States, whether it's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, Germany, we are the largest economies and everyone is off track. And this then translates to despair and hopelessness amongst people like us. There was a poll that was done a few months ago. This was across the world, and they were asked, is climate change beyond our control? Is it too late to do anything about it? So about 47% disagree. They said, no, we can do something about it. But then when Indians were asked the same question, only 17% disagreed, 67% felt climate change was beyond our control. So we've got to do something about this. This feeling of helplessness, this feeling of, well, our governments are not delivering. What do? We are doomed. Yet 77% of Indians also agreed that small changes in our own behavior, in our own lives, everyday lives, could bring about a positive impact. This is where the built environment begins to become important. We've got climate despair at one end, and this conscious collective is all about building bridges, right? So what we need is building the collective consciousness. We need to adopt innovative solutions. I'll talk about them in a bit. We've got to connect those solutions to individual action, learn lessons from across the world, so we go from climate despair to the climate doable. This is really the thesis I want to present before you today. Now, why the built environment? Because this is where we all engage with each other. We live here, we move here, we work here. So there's an urban scale, how we design our cities. Within those cities, there's a material and design scale. Then we have that material and design coming together in built spaces. And then we have our own individual behavior within those built spaces. I'm going to give you some examples based on the research that we've been doing with our collaborators on how there are examples at each of these scales for us to internalize and incorporate. The built environment accounts for about 37% of all the emissions that we let out. So it's an important, non-trivial share of what we need to do, whether it's residential, non-residential, the materials embedded in it, the bricks, the glass, and all of that stuff. So let's start with the urban scale. This, of course, is an AI-generated image. I would love our cities to look like this, but anyway, for now, let's go from artificial to intelligent. Why is building our cities greener so much more important? When we see temperatures rising across the world, we're talking about average temperatures, average surface temperatures. But then when we come to cities, they have this thing called the urban heat island effect. It's our built environment that adds a few more degrees to the heat that we experience. So rural farmland is about 29 degrees. Commercial spaces actually 3 degrees warmer. But then you can go to parks, the green areas, and you again bring that down by 3 degrees. This is why heat stress for Indian cities must be dealt with by many solutions, but not without forgetting the natural environment. Last year, we had the hottest February since 1901, more than 100 years. 10 cities have faced prolonged heat waves. A heat wave lasts about 3-4 days. This summer, it went up to about 20 days. Coastal cities then face compounding risks because that humidity adds to that felt heat, what is called the wet bulb temperature. So urban design potential can help to bring down that peak surface temperature and reduce the temperatures that we feel within buildings. So here's an example from a city in Colombia, Medellin. In Medellin, they brought in this green corridors idea. So 30 green corridors, 12 waterways, 18 roads, about 70 hectares of green space, 20 kilometers of shaded routes. They spent a bit of money, but it resulted in nearly 1 million trees, a temperature reduction on average of 2 degrees, improvement in air quality, jobs for the local people, and most importantly, carbon abatement. And now they're looking at how do they bring the citizens and the government together for what is called participatory budgeting. When citizens feel that their quality of life is improving, they might be willing to contribute more towards those investments. But closer to home, down south in Telangana, after an initial pilot amongst a few NGOs, they decided to have a cool roof policy last year. Now this would cover about 300 square kilometers over the next 5 years of cool roofs, would result in savings of 600 million gigawatt hours of electricity. It would be driven across the state. Right now, in the pilot, just 25 roofs in the low-income areas resulted again in an average decline in temperatures by 2 degrees. So again, we've got to focus on how do we take these lower-cost solutions and scale them up. That requires government budgets, of course, but it requires incentives. So when you're building your homes, when you're getting into your apartment blocks, how do we incorporate these solutions into our built environment, into the imagination of our built space? The next scale was the material and the design scale. So you've decided that you want to green up your city, but you've still got to build some buildings. Those buildings have embedded materials. Those materials have embedded carbon. So it's important. Well, actually, let me go back and tell you a little bit. It's going to be a little bit of a digression, but I want to tell you about this picture. We initiated an art and climate fellowship last year. And one of those fellows put this installation together. I don't know if you can see it. You see the gray part and the brown part? So this artist went and stayed for a few months with the Gond tribe community in Odisha. And their traditional huts were made of that brown adobe material. Now, because of climate change and extreme weather along the coast of Odisha, the cyclones that were slamming that part of the country was resulting in these mud huts getting washed away. Now, if the cyclones weren't there, this would have been traditional and sustainable building material. Now, in order to make more pakka homes, they decided to go more concrete. Now, what's this done is, the homes are more stable and resilient. The indoors are much less resilient. They've become an oven. Now, this is creating social disruptions, because now the men are sleeping outdoors, the women and children are sleeping indoors. So something that seems so abstract as climate change and temperature rise at a global level, now reduced to the scale of the home of a tribal dwelling. Adobe versus concrete, kacha versus pakka, mental health versus declining mental health, close-knit families versus breaking up families. This is how the abstractness of climate change becomes much more real in terms of the quality of life of individual citizens. Well, so much for that digression, which is why we need to focus on the materials we are using in our built environment. 13% of global CO2 emissions come from the materials used in these construction processes. 29 to 43% of buildings' carbon footprint comes from that embedded carbon. And 95% of that embedded carbon comes from concrete, steel, the walling materials. Now, can we use more efficient concrete, which is 40% less emissions? Recycle the construction and demolition waste so you're not using virgin materials. Think about different kinds of walling materials with low embodied carbon, low thermal conductivity, less density, so the buildings are less heavy, you therefore need less steel. And then you incorporate it in conceptualizing, designing, and building those buildings. So let's take a look at some examples. I gave you the example from a tribal community in Odisha, so worthwhile talking about Odisha's own Krushi Bhavan. Now this building, first of all, let me just go back to the image. Although it's a government Sarkari building, it doesn't look like a very government Sarkari building, right? Because the ground floor is this open plaza, which is ventilated by the natural environment. Right on top, on the roof, which you can't see, is our plantations for the kinds of sustainable crops that they're experimenting with. And then you have the airflow that is coming in from that open plaza, cooling the building. This has resulted in 100% daylit internal spaces, much better heating and cooling. You're avoiding air conditioning in 80% of the occupied area, temperature reductions, reduced carbon footprint, reduced. Let me give another example. Now in the West, Rajkot. This is a low-cost housing. Now again, why? Because low-cost housing is going to be a big part of our built environment as we move away from the, again, kacha homes to the pakka homes. We've got to make sure these pakka homes are not ovens. So this Rajkot Smart Ghar design again uses similar design characteristics, natural airflow, natural ventilation, reduced air conditioning. You have the building envelope that is designed in a way along with the windows fenestration and the assisted ventilation that is reducing the heat load, peak temperature reduced by more than 5 degrees in the summer. Number of comfortable hours, that is under 30 degrees, increases nearly threefold as a result of this building design. But because you're doing this in low-cost solutions, you're able to then think of scaling it up for the hundreds of millions of people in India that will move into our urban spaces and will need spaces like these to live in. So once we've started thinking about these designs, we've got to actually think about a building. Now, integrating these technologies helps reduce the actual operational carbon footprint in our buildings. Because 34% of annual electricity consumption is coming from the actual use of the residential commercial buildings. 40% increase in 8 years as a result of the increasing demand. There'll be 46% increase in sale of electricity because of this increasing demand. 14% increase in connected load, and so on and so forth. So we got to think about, is the building designed in a way that it is sufficient for a more low carbon lifestyle, that it enables more energy efficient, not just materials, but operations, that it allows for alternatives like integrating renewables into the building design, and so forth. So let me give some examples, and now this gets personal. This photograph is a CEEW sustainable headquarters. Now we don't own this building. We're leasing the building. But the building, when we took it on, was, I won't name the company, but it was the R&D headquarters for one of the world's leading tech firms. And I entered the building, and it was all boarded up. Every single window was boarded up. So it felt like I'm entering a space-age compound with no natural light, all artificial air conditioning. So we had to strip it down and rebuild it from scratch on the inside. We'd welcome you to come visit CEEW. While this looks like a fancy office, the whole focus was on sustainability. Started with biodegradable flooring. The entire flooring, which is non-carpeted, is biodegradable. Then we said, let's reuse all the materials in our previous office, which was much smaller in scale, and repurpose it. This simple coffee table is actually a planter that we repurpose as a coffee table. Or we took ducting from older offices and made it into side tables. But then we got into more interesting things. The entire upholstery, 70% jute. The carpeting, this type of carpeting, was manufactured in a factory running 100% of renewables with over 64% recycled material. Then we opened up the windows, took down those boardings, and we let natural light flow from the east to the west axis all day long. So regardless of where you're in the building, at some point or the other, there's natural light coming in, reduce the lighting load by 30%. The water is then retreated both for washing dishes, but also irrigating the more than 1,000 plants we have. And less than 5% of our entire waste goes to a landfill. And we've got screens across the office that keeps telling us, don't just talk about sustainability, do it. So this month, we generated this much waste, so how much lesser waste can we generate next month? This is possible even in a rented space, because often we say, oh, well, I don't have control over this. I'm just renting someone else's built environment. But this is about conscious collective, right? So we have to be conscious of the spaces we design, even if we don't own them. This is another building in Delhi, the UN House, designed by famous architect Joseph Stein. It was sustainable, it was airy, it was built with natural materials, but it is also old. So I guess 50 years. So it was retrofitted with all sorts of new things on passive cooling and active cooling, and resulted in reducing cooling load by 10%, increasing energy savings by up to 50%, solar PV on the rooftops, and so forth. Again, you can take an old building and retrofit it. Not just think about, okay, I will think sustainable when I build something new. Finally, I come down to you and me, the last scale, the consumer scale. These cartoons we publish every Wednesday. Our mascot at CEEW is this pale blue dot, the Earth. We call these cartoons Water on Earth. So I will welcome you to visit our website or track these cartoons every Wednesday. But really what these 4 cartoons are talking about is the choices we make as individuals. So I'm going to just close with a few examples there. Let's start again with cooling. Across the world, a hotter climate will result in more cooling demand. But just look at India, which will have the world's fastest growth in cooling demand because we built a hotter planet. If we instead used behavioral interventions to change our own approaches, we could reduce energy use in India by 2030 alone by about 10 terawatt hours per year, reduce emissions per year by about 5 million tons, and bring in about up to 2,000 gigawatt hours per year within the next 2 years of potential energy savings simply by deploying a simple solution like telling the consumer how much energy they're consuming. Just that information alone starts to nudge behavior. So I'll give 2 examples and I'll close. One is an example from Thailand, and they use something called a power ledger. Now, what is this term called prosumer? The prosumer is one who's not just consuming energy, but also producing energy. But in order to be an optimal prosumer, you need to consume it when you need it, but sell it when someone else needs it. That's where the decarbonization revolution comes together with the digital revolution. So they created a peer-to-peer trading platform in this one district in Bangkok. It resulted in the residents in that area understanding not just the benefits of clean energy for themselves, the benefits to their pockets, because they could then trade with each other rather than waiting for the electricity utility to deliver the electricity, which is then delivered via transmission lines, which then picks up the electricity from some faraway power plant. When you bring the energy transition closer to people, you can actually make them agents of change. Help them participate, help them engage. And that then results in much faster adoption of these efficient technologies and behavioral approaches. Last example, Japan went through a massive earthquake in 2011. As a result, shut down all its nuclear power plants after the Fukushima accident. There was a massive increase, or rather massive increase in the power deficit as a result of shutting down those plants. So they adopted a program called Cool Biz. They say, okay, we'll raise the ambient temperature inside the built environment from about 20 degrees to 27 degrees. And you take off your ties and come to office. But then they scaled that up and started 3 different ministries came together to start teaching homeowners, school students, etc., the value of passive design rather than active air conditioning. Even using manga comics for children to educate the future consumers. Comprehensive energy labeling program, similar to what we've been doing in India to encourage energy efficiency. So what have I been saying? We started with despair because the climate is changing. Extreme weather is coming our way. It is making us more vulnerable. The governments of the largest economies on the planet are not delivering fast enough. But the governments are also representative of us. When we realize that our built spaces, our lived spaces, our cities are where it's all at, then we realize that from a city scale to the material scale to the building scale to us, we can begin to make a difference. To use our consciousness and our collective endeavor to bridge from climate despair to climate doable. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. I might not have all the answers. And please introduce yourself so I know where you're from and what you do.
Hi, I'm Karthik from School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. I have even previously interned with CEEW with the Sustainable Mobility team. So I wanted to ask, you have the teams, energy transition, powers, mobility. So what, according to you, will be the main catalyst by 2050 to bring about the temperature rise, which will be the most contributing in bringing down the temperature rise? The renewable energy is the mobility emissions or consumer scales?
Sure. Thanks. That answer will vary depending on the country. In India, we have to start with the power sector decarbonization. That is the largest source of emissions. If you went to the United States, transport decarbonization has to be a big focus. If you came back to India, industrial decarbonization will be extremely important. Now, you talked about 2050, right? Now, let's go back 15 years. So 2050 is 25 years away. Let's go back 15 years when our national solar mission had just been designed and not even kicked off. And we had less than 20 megawatts of solar in the country. Today, we have over 90,000 megawatts of solar in the country. We have over 150,000 megawatts of what we call pure renewables, wind and solar and bioenergy. Along with large hydro and nuclear, we have over 200,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity, which is now about 47% of our installed electricity capacity. That's the good news. How much electricity are we generating from clean energy? The generation share is much lower, only about 20%. We've got to raise that level to much higher levels. In order to accelerate that, some of the other things you mentioned. So it's not just about putting in more and more solar plants. As I said, when we start becoming prosumers rather than just consumers, we start optimizing for when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing, we start trading with each other. You and I might be at work or in university during the day. All that solar we are generating at that time, we are not using it in our homes, right? But that same energy could be used to power up the electric vehicles. So then we can accelerate the charging stations and the build out of that for our electric vehicles. Or we could use it for food preservation by using the renewable energy to cool down our cold chain and our cold storage infrastructure. Once we start thinking about these, not in silos, is it power, is it industry, is it homes, is it cars, and see that electron is not just a product, but a service, then we begin to actually get into a much more interesting world of the future of power markets, the future of energy markets, which is more fluid. Take, for example, the cell phone. Right? You would have heard of the point that India and other developing countries have leapfrogged from the landline to the cell phone. But the real leapfrog is not from the landline to the cell phone. It's from reducing the cost of a call, which, when I was growing up, an intercity call would have cost a few hundred rupees per minute, to effectively zero. The marginal cost of the call is effectively zero. The marginal cost, for those economists in the room, of an electron of solar energy is effectively zero. Once you've built it out, the sun is free. So where do you get value from? The value in the phone is from the data services. The byte is not a product, it's a service that you and I are paying for. The electron is not a product, but a service that you and I can trade. Once we start thinking with that kind of imagination, the digital revolution, the decarbonization revolution, and the decentralization of our built spaces begins to offer a much accelerated path towards a more sustainable future. Anyone else? Yeah, let me take her and then I'll come to you, Prachi. Because Prachi, you can ask me questions anytime.
Hi, it's always lovely to hear you speak. This is my second time hearing you speak, of course. I'm also a sustainability professional. I'm going to hold you to your first sentence, COP29, and your stance on India's updated NDCs for next year, and how maybe COP29 or climate justice or just transition is going to impact that.
Okay. Maybe in the interest of time, Prachi, I'll take your question as well, and then we'll close.
So there's a lot of internal CEEW people here. It's a happy accident. But CEEW and UN Foundation also runs this wonderful program called Next Generation India Fellowship, which is about how young people can be involved in shaping the world and the country. So we get to interact with a lot of young people. There's also a lot of young people here who have the same question, that climate change seems like such a big issue. What can I do in the face of something so big? So could you help answer that question for all the young people who are here? What can I do about climate change? And if I want to get into this space, how do I get started?
Okay, let me answer the climate justice point first. It's important to understand what do we mean by climate justice. One understanding of it is someone else polluted and I'm suffering. So there has to be some justice. Another dimension of this is that someone promised me money, but I'm not getting it, and I can't make myself more resilient against those vulnerabilities without those resources. There has to be some justice. Put it more simply, there's a principle of polluter pays. You pollute, you pay. You go into a shop, you break it, you pay for it, right? Even if you didn't break it intentionally. This is not about intentionality. This is about the impact of our outcomes, of our actions, and the outcomes it has on others. The problem we've had with the promises made in the climate negotiations is that while the ambitions have been low, the actions have been lower, the accountability has been absent. As a result, the deal we got in Baku, at least according to me, changed that principle of polluter pays to I pollute and you pay. And that to me is injustice. But that to me equally is not an excuse for us not acting. And this is the difference between what we say in climate negotiations, but also what we do at home in India. The example we just talked about renewables, or industry, or mobility, this is all things we've got to do here. What I spent the last 40 minutes talking to you about, our built spaces can be built more sustainably, more green, more clean, more affordable if we put our consciousness and our collective action to it. We don't have to wait around for the money to flow from top. That the money should flow to the most vulnerable, yes. But it is not an excuse for us to say we will not act. And it's very important not to let the despair of global negotiations color the energy we might have of doing things at home. Which brings me to Prachi's question. What do the young do? Honestly, Prachi, you should answer that question. When I set up CEEW, I was young. I think I still am young. I'm older than I'm younger than I look. What was my action? I wanted to set up an institution that focused on collecting the data and figuring out the business models that get you to scale in, say, renewables. But other youngsters could come and develop a cleaner and greener and less weightier brick. Someone else can come and create a digital trading platform. Someone else can come and figure out faster charging, not for giant electric SUVs, but for smaller electric two-wheelers. We've got to basically bring about the solutions that are closer to home, that are relevant for our context. So the example I would give is from a lady called Usha Rani. She is a single mother, smallholder farmer in the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh. I met her a few years ago. She owns a plot of land which is less than half an acre. Less than an acre, about between half and 3/4 of an acre. On that one single plot of land, she grows 15 different crops using natural farming. No chemical fertilizers, no chemical pesticides. And I asked her, why have you, sort of at the, literally not just the margins of society, but the margins of even the agricultural value chain, taken on such a risky proposition of growing more sustainable crops, but don't necessarily fetch you more money in the market, the government doesn't have a procurement scheme for this, etc. So in her response, she told me about her late husband. And she said, when my husband died, I was in despair. I had these 2 children I had to feed, put them through school. But in our local dialect, some dialect of Telugu, so in our local dialect, we have a saying, when we lose something, we also look for the answers where we lost it. She decided to look for answers on the land that she was on and decided to experiment with natural farming. I say this because when we talk about sustainability, renewables, mobility, industry, buildings, we have a tech-centric mindset and we think it's high capital intensive, etc. And the richer we get, the more risk averse we get. The poorer you are, you've almost got nothing to lose. And yet, the experiments, the innovations are being tried out at that end of society. And we've got to ask ourselves the question, if we've got age on our side, we've got energy on our side, we've got imagination on our side, why are we so risk averse? So my simple answer to you, Prachi, is just imagine. And the work you're doing and the other Next Gen India fellows are doing, and they've brought out a dictionary of the future. And one of the words in that dictionary of the future they've written up is called carbon handprint. So instead of the carbon footprint of us as it's almost like a parasitic species on the planet, the handprint is not how much carbon you're adding, but how much carbon you're taking away. The handprints of all our actions will come from our collective consciousness. Thank you.